The membrane had been breathing for 6 hours. Not expanding, not retreating, just pressing. A slow, rhythmic distension against the outpost's outer skin, like something on the other side had learned the wall existed and was trying to decide what to do about that information. Ravi had logged it at hour 1, notified the team, got back 3 words: monitor, we're moving. 3 days out, monitor it was. He sat in the medbay with his feet on the instrument bench and a protein paste container going cold in his hand, watching the exterior feed on the secondary screen. The thing pressing against the membrane was not large. It was tendrilous, a reaching. It moved with the particular patience of something that had already tried every faster option and found none of them useful. The outpost's environmental system kept cycling alerts about unidentified biological contact, and Ravi kept silencing them. Because what was he going to do? Shoot a tendril. At hour 6 it came through. Not violently. The membrane didn't tear. The tendril found a seam, the pressure seal around the secondary cargo bay, which had been leaking atmosphere in negligible quantities since the supply run 3 weeks ago, and came through the path of least resistance, the way water does, the way anything persistent enough does. It curled into the cargo bay floor and rested there. The atmospheric sensors screamed. Ravi silenced those too. He stood in the cargo bay doorway for a long moment. The tendril was the diameter of his thumb, dark as dried blood, faintly iridescent where the work lights caught it. It wasn't moving anymore. It had arrived, and now it was waiting. The translator unit on his belt crackled. It did that sometimes. It was calibrated for the 3 species they'd been briefed on, none of which were whatever this was, but it crackled, and then it produced a sound. And then, haltingly, like a man reading a language he'd studied in a book but never spoken aloud, it produced a word. Please. Ravi looked at the tendril for a while. Okay, he said, give me a minute. The matriarch had not eaten in 11 cycles. She did not experience this the way a creature with a stomach experiences hunger, as a thing located in the body demanding. Her experience of need was distributed, the way all her experience was distributed. She felt it through her children, through the dimming of their signal and the pheromone web she maintained from the nest wall. One by one, the larval nodes in her network were going quiet. Not dead, she would have felt that differently, would have felt it as a severing, a cut thread but muted. Turned inward, conserving. She had been built for this wall. Her body had spent 8 cycles growing into it, root-like, load-bearing, until she was no longer separate from the nest so much as she was the nest's reasoning apparatus. She could not leave. She could extend, through her tendrils, to the limits of the tunnel network, and she had extended, for 11 cycles, through territory that had gone barren in ways she did not have evolutionary precedent to understand. The node at the tunnel's far edge had found the structure. The structure was wrong in every sensory dimension she possessed. It smelled of nothing biological, a kind of sensory silence that her cognition kept trying to fill and finding nothing to fill it with. It held heat in ways that rock does not. And it contained, her tendril sense told her, mass that moved of its own volition. She had debated this for 6 of her daughter's hunger cycles. Then she had sent the signal, the only signal she had ever sent outside her species. She had no grammar for it, no receiver protocol, no expectation of comprehension. She sent it because there was nothing else left. The mass on the other side did not flee. She adjusted her model of it fractionally. The translator had logged 11 minutes of acoustic data before it produced please, and it kept producing things after that, in fragments that arrived like objects washed up after a wreck, partial, stripped of context, suggestive of a larger structure she'd had no part of. Hunger state young many, long count without. Ravi sat cross-legged on the cargo bay floor, 2 meters from the tendril, with his tablet on his knee and his full inventory open on the screen. I'm going to read you what I have, he said, not because he thought she could understand him. The translator was strictly one-directional at this point, pulling signal from her end with nothing reliable going back, but because he needed to think out loud and she was there. I'm going to read you what I have, and I'm going to need you to be patient with me, because I have no idea what your children can eat and I have one shot at not making this worse. He started with the protein pastes, molecular breakdown as best he knew it, then the emergency rations, then the mineral supplements, then, because he was thorough, the stuff he'd never once expected to use, the soil analog growth medium he'd brought for the xenobotany team, the bacterial cultures for the mobile lab, 3 kinds of nutritional support for patients in tissue shock. The tendril didn't move. The translator crackled twice, producing nothing coherent. And then, at the very end of the cargo bay, the membrane shivered. And a second tendril came through, smaller, finer, the diameter of a pencil, moving with none of the patient deliberation of the first. It moved the way a young thing moves, unsteady, urgent, toward the light. Ravi looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the translator, which was still processing, and said, "To know one and both of them." "How many?" The translator took 40 seconds. "Many," it said. "Count is wrong. Count has been wrong for." It couldn't produce the number. It produced instead a sound that it could not translate at all, which it flagged in Ravi's log as unit, unknown, duration metric, significant. He looked at the small tendril, still reaching toward the light. "Okay," he said, and reached for the mineral supplements first, because he had a hunch, and because hunch was all he had, and because sitting on the floor doing nothing while something's children went quiet seemed like an obscene waste of a perfectly functional circulatory system. The convulsion was small. That was the thing he kept coming back to later. It was small, and it stopped quickly, and the larva was still moving after, but he'd watched it happen and he'd thought, "I did that." He'd offered the protein paste first. The translator had managed young and hunger, and he'd matched those 2 words to the paste's high-density caloric profile and thought, "Obvious. Start obvious." The tendril that was young touched it and recoiled. And the motion traveled back through the membrane somehow, translated into a sound from the Matriarch's end that the translator didn't touch, didn't try to, just logged as acoustic and flagged as distress, high confidence. Ravi pulled his hand back. The paste container clattered against the floor. The thing that happened next happened fast. The pheromone level in the cargo bay spiked. His atmospheric sensors went from 1 alert to 7 in under a second. And the temperature at the membrane dropped 3 degrees, because something on the other side had responded to the sound of her distress by flooding the tunnel with something biological and chemical, and very clearly a warning. He knew what warning felt like. He'd done 3 deployments on worlds where warning was the last polite thing anything said to you before it stopped being polite. He did not leave. He sat down, on the floor, where he'd been before. He put the protein paste container to one side, out of the way, and he pulled his inventory tablet back onto his knee, and he started reading it aloud again from the beginning. Protein paste, standard issue, caloric density 4.2 per gram, primary compounds. She had misread the retreat. The mass that moved had offered a substance to one of her daughters. Her daughter had rejected it. The mineral profile was incompatible at a level that triggered a recoil response, and the mass that moved had pulled back. In her experience, things that pulled back from a rejection were completing a predator assessment, testing for weakness, finding it, preparing the next action. She had sent the warning flood because that was the protocol for a predator that had found weakness, make the cost of action visible. She was immobile. She could not fight. She could fill the air with the truth of what it would cost. The mass that moved did not leave. This did not fit the predator model. She held the warning flood for 3 of her own heartbeats, which were slow, which measured in minutes, and during those 3 beats she extended every sensory tendril she had toward the cargo space and tried to resolve the contradiction. The mass that moved was producing sound, Continuous sound. Patterned. The translator node it carried was not keeping pace. She had learned to distinguish its outputs from the raw acoustic, learned that the translator node was behind, always trying to catch up, but the raw acoustic had a quality she had no category for. It was not warning. It was not hunger. It was not the sound of a thing that had found weakness and was preparing to use it. It was the sound of a thing that was explaining itself. To her, she checked her model and found it inadequate, possibly to her daughter. Her daughter, the smallest, the one who had come through the membrane on her own initiative against all caste logic, was at the gap, was not retreating, was making a small, continuous motion that in Vareth cognition meant, I am assessing, I am not yet decided. The matriarch did not lower the warning flood. But she did not advance it either. She waited, in the way she had learned to wait, distributed across 37 daughter signals, feeling each one as a note in a chord that was slowly, over 11 cycles, going flat, and she tried to find a category that fit the behavior of the mass that moved. She did not find one. She kept waiting. He read the whole inventory again. Took him 22 minutes. At the end of it, he sat with the tablet dark in his lap and looked at the small tendril that hadn't retreated and thought about what he actually knew, not what he'd been briefed on, not what the specs said, what he'd observed in the last 2 hours with his own eyes. They were eusocial. The big tendril and the small tendril were not the same organism. The movement patterns were too different. The responses were offset. There was something hierarchical in the way the small one had waited for the large one to initiate before it came through, which meant there was a central node somewhere, a thinker, someone he was actually talking to, in whatever limited sense talking applied here. They rejected the protein paste hard, recoil, not just avoidance. The pheromone flood that followed the rejection was still present in the air, faint now, his sensors showing it declining gradually, which meant it wasn't being actively maintained anymore. Which meant she'd made a decision about him. He didn't know what decision. He picked up his atmospheric analysis kit and started running a soil sample he'd taken near the membrane breach, the exterior readings, the stuff that had been clinging to the tendril when it came through, the mineral profile of her environment, or as close as he could approximate. The results took 4 minutes. He looked at them. He looked at the emergency ration kit, specifically at the mineral supplement tabs designed for patients in soul-deprived environments, specifically at the magnesium silicate and trace iron compounds in the secondary profile. The overlap was not perfect. It was not close to perfect. It was approximate the way a rough sketch is approximate, recognizable as the right shape. He looked at the small tendril. I'm going to try something, he said. I need you to not call the flood back. The tendril moved, not retreat, the small assessing motion. He took that as whatever it was, the larva ate. Not vigorously, not with the urgency of something that has been waiting 11 cycles for relief. She took the mineral supplement tab with the slow, thorough motility of a creature whose systems had learned to mistrust input, testing it at every surface, processing in stages. Ravi sat very still and watched and did not say anything for almost 3 minutes, which was, for him, an enormous act of discipline. The matriarch felt it before she could parse it. One node in the cord, the smallest, the one at the gap, shifted, not loudly, not a full return, but the quality of its signal changed from conserving to something that in her distributed experience was the equivalent of a key turning. The count did not stop being wrong, but it was wrong by 1 fewer. She had no word for this. She had the sensation of it, which was not located anywhere in her body but was distributed across the rootwork of her, the way all her experience was, and the sensation was of a single thread in a loosening, not pulling taut again. She did not have a word for hope, she had this. He was narrating again. He couldn't help it, it was a field medicine habit, developed during his second deployment when he'd learned that talking a patient through a procedure reduced the stress response in both of them, and it had stuck, generalized, become reflexive. He narrated when he was uncertain. It was his version of thinking out loud, except directed outward. "That's the magnesium silicate doing the work, I think," he said. "Your soil reads iron-heavy and silicon-heavy, and the standard paste is carbon chain dominant, which is not useful to you. The emergency tabs are blended for depletion states, broad spectrum. They've got a higher mineral density than anything else I'm carrying." He was talking to the larva. The larva had no cognition he could identify, just the slow, thorough motion of eating. He kept talking anyway. "I've got 32 tabs. I don't know how many of you there are, or how much you need per unit, so I'm going to have to ration until I can figure out if there's anything in the exterior soil I can actually process for you, which is going to be." The translator crackled. He stopped. It was working harder than it had yet worked. He could see the processing load on the unit's display. The input queue backed up with 43 minutes of accumulated acoustic data it was only now catching up to. The outputs had been fragmentary all evening. This one arrived differently. This one arrived whole. "Why do you explain yourself to a thing that cannot hear you?" Ravi looked at the translator for a moment. Then he looked at the tendril, the large one, the original one, still resting on the cargo bay floor 2 meters from him. "She can hear me," he said. "She's the one I'm talking to." The translator could not carry that back. The output function was still essentially non-functional, nothing reliable going in her direction. But he said it anyway because it was true, and because it seemed important that true things be said aloud even when no one could verify them. The sound stream from the mast that moved had been arriving for hours, and the translator node had been processing it in fragments, inadequate, and she had been assembling what she could from the fragments the way she assembled spatial models from partial tendril data, inferentially, with gaps, revising continuously. What she had assembled was this. The mass that moved was not predating. It was not assessing for weakness. It was performing a behavior she had no template for, which was explaining its own actions in sequence to the organism it was acting upon. She had never encountered this. In Vareth cognition, actions required no narration. The pheromone web communicated state, not intent, what was happening, not why. Intent was for outcomes. You assessed intent from what occurred. But the mass that moved was producing intent before the outcome. It was producing a model of its own future actions and offering that model outward, to her daughter, to the heir. The word she found for this, finally, after 3 heartbeats of processing, was not quite right, but it was the closest she had, honest. She did not know what to do with honest. She sat with it, distributed across 37 dimming signals and one that had fractionally brightened, and she found the edge of a question forming in the part of her that had learned, over 11 cycles, to distrust everything that came from outside the nest. The question arrived in the translator 40 seconds later, processed, partial, the grammar mangled by the unit's still limited model. "You know, count of my young ones." He looked at the translator. "No," he said, "I don't. I was hoping you'd tell me." The cargo bay was quiet except for the atmospheric recyclers, and the slow, thorough sound of the small tendril still working through the supplement tab. The translator crackled once more, tried, produced 3 words and stopped. "Then how?" It couldn't finish. The unit flagged the remaining acoustic as grammatically indeterminate, emotional loading, high confidence. Ravi looked at the fragment. He looked at the small tendril, still eating. He looked at the 31 supplement tabs remaining in the kit. "I'll figure it out," he said. He paused, tried to find something accurate and landed on the plainest version. "That's what I do." The translator did not carry it across. "But the large tendril, the original one, which had been resting motionless on the cargo bay floor for 3 hours, moved. Not toward him, not away. It simply reoriented, turned slightly, the way a face turns when it has decided to keep listening.